Hi, this is Skowski, and in this video we're going to be looking at a letter from Birmingham Jail by the Greek Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And this is such a powerful document, and it is one of the foundational documents that the College Board requires you to know for the AP Gov exam. So I'm going to be discussing some major overtones and undertones of this document, but I highly encourage you to read it on your own. It is a little bit of a lengthier document, but certainly a very powerful one to read. So again, after this video, I would highly encourage you to read it on your own, as you will certainly gain an appreciation for the civil rights movement if you don't already have one. So let's get into the background here. Martin Luther King is actually arrested in Birmingham because there was actually an infraction of parading without a permit. And he's going to be spending 11 days in solitary confinement in this dingy, awful jail in Birmingham. And he's going to basically put out this very long letter. And it's a response that is directed toward 8 Alabama clergymen who released a statement toward King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which had begun flooding into Birmingham to protest the awful civil rights violations being inflicted upon blacks. So King's response here is going to establish the foundation for nonviolent direct action and will be the bedrock of the civil rights movement. I mean, such a powerful document in so many ways. So what precipitates this is from the joint clergymen's statement from the white churches in Birmingham. And these are some of their problems with King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In particular, they're saying that, ending this inequality, and they're not disagreeing that there is inequality, but they're saying that this should be done in the courts. Take this out of the streets, put it in the courts. They're also saying that responsible citizens are already working on these constructive and a realistic approach towards racial problems. He's telling the demonstrators that these are being done by outsiders, not local blacks in Birmingham, and that they have to be patient, that he eventually will come. And then perhaps most offensive is that they write that hatred and violence have no sanction in our religious and political traditions. And he's not referring so much to the terrible actions inflicted upon many of the civil rights protesters. He's talking about the civil rights protesters with respect to quote-unquote violence, and that that their actions are inciting hatred and violence. And in many ways, they're blaming the victims here as opposed to the people who are perpetrating these awful and horrific civil rights violations. So that's sort of the background as to why King is going to write this response. And I'm going to highlight some of the key ideas here, but again, you should certainly read this on your own. It's a very powerful and awesome document. And one of the big quotes that's going to stand out here is the idea of injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And that's sort of in response to this notion that you guys are a bunch of outsiders, this is a local problem. Well, King's going to respond to that and say, absolutely not. Take it in a form of like cancer, right? If you have skin cancer, that's one of the not as bad cancers. Of course, you don't ever want to get cancer, but cancer anywhere in the body can rapidly spread and metastasize. You don't want that to happen. And King is sort of looking at injustice in the same way. If it's happening in the small pocket of the country, even though it's happening way more beyond that it's a threat to justice everywhere. And this is going to be important because they're going to be confronting this head on. They're going to be using sit-ins and marches as opposed to these sideline tactics of negotiation, which isn't going anywhere. They're not negotiating in good faith. There's not a lot of muster behind it. So now King is going to be confronting this directly and making this inconvenient for whites in Birmingham. You can't avoid the issue. You can't sit on the sidelines. And this is going to be a very important tactic in the civil rights movement. And again, nonviolence as the bedrock. There's also the notion that, blacks should just wait, to wait it out in the courts. It's going to happen. Just give it a few more years or decades. Well, King's going to say, well, this is just such an insulting argument, but King is going to respond to that by saying that slaves have already waited 345 years for freedom. Isn't that long enough? And then to add insult to injury, you have Jim Crow laws, you have police beating the heck out of these civil rights protesters, and they're being denied their civil rights. And isn't that long enough? I mean, they should be waiting longer. I mean, as police are bashing their heads in with batons, utilizing fire hoses, on top of that, using dogs to bite these protesters. I mean, it's just quite awful. And he's also going to respond to the idea of that by saying freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Basically, if you're just going to sit around, you think that the whites in power are going to be like, okay, I think it's time that we give these former, slaves to, these rights. No, that's not how it works. That's not how history works. It has to be demanded, and that's why King is going to be advocating to confront these injustices head on, again, through nonviolence. He's even going to discuss the impact on his own 6-year-old daughter. He even makes reference to that when she wants to go to Funland. However, it is only for white children, and he talks about how disappointed she is. And again, the emotional toll that that's going to have upon her. So this is having a lot of problems, even emotionally and psychologically. And then onto this, the idea that, you should just let these unjust and immoral laws just be and just wait them out in the court system. And certainly that was a strategy that's going to be used during the civil rights movement through the Legal Defense Fund. But the idea of just sitting back and not taking any action, well, that's a problem. And he even references the fact that Hitler and his actions were deemed legal in Germany. So again, an unjust law is no law at all. And as a result, that needs to be confronted head on. And he has a lot of problems with these white moderates who claim to be Christian, who claim to be moral people, yet they're on the sidelines. And they're the ones who are saying that these protesters are agitators, they're outsiders, they don't belong here, give it time. Well, that's a problem. And he's going to be able to understand that this is misdirected blame. And I love this quote here where he's saying society must protect the robbed and punish the robber. Right? At this point, there's a lot of victim blaming. And what have they done wrong? They're not even just asking now, they're going to be demanding their rights. And, the idea that King and the protesters are extremists, at first King's going to take issue with that, but later he's going to embrace that concept. He's going to even mention, wasn't Jesus Christ an extremist in love? He's going to say, was not Abraham Lincoln an extremist as well, and Thomas Jefferson? So he's sort of using this very interesting, these historical leaders who are revered, especially in Birmingham, Alabama, and he's going to be sort of, well, maybe not Lincoln so much, but Jefferson and Jesus certainly, as you have a lot of Christians there. But in the idea that yes, these people were considered extremists, and now when you look at it, when history judged them, they judge them so much more for the better. So ultimately, he's going to wrap up this letter by expressing his sincere disappointment with the white churches who have done really nothing. They're sort of part of the problem. They're on the sidelines with the white moderates. And he's really encouraging them to take action, to stand with them, and to really commend these black demonstrators for their courage. Again, I mean, whether it's sit-ins in white-only establishments where they might be getting, beat up by batons. They might be spending days in a coma, depending on how severe those blows are to their heads. They were even risking their own lives. And King is really stressing that point. What's interesting, too, at the end, he writes that if any part of his letter is found to be offensive, he certainly says that he apologizes for that. He really means to be respectful. But again, put yourself in the shoes of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in a jail, going through all this racism and being 11 days in jail in these awful decrepit conditions, and writing such a powerful document. So that is certainly the Birmingham Jail letter in a nutshell. Again, I highly encourage you to read it in its entirety. It is a fantastic document, and certainly one that you're going to need to use on the AP Gov exam.